Okay, so this next conversation, I actually think will be one of the most provocative and fascinating ones to discuss. When putting together this summit on poverty and technology, we realized that we couldn't avoid the other elephant in the room, which of course is, what does the future look like? Where are we going to be on jobs? What's employability going to look like? And is this a revolution that actually benefits most or works to the detriment of most? So we have Rob Reich, who's the co-director of the Stanford Center on Philanthropy, who's a superstar in his own right, will be moderating a conversation with our speakers and the audience after. So we want your questions. We want you to be thinking about your questions as people speak. But we're going to kick off with a few minutes each from Martin Ford, who, for those of you who have been living under a rock for the last 2 years, is the best-selling author and a futurist who wrote Rise of the Robots, probably one of the most provocative books of the last few years, and Tim O'Reilly, who is a huge thinker, as you know, from the CEO of O'Reilly Media, but also one of the biggest thinkers in the Valley on the impact of technology and what we can be doing with it. There are basically two propositions on the table, to put them very dramatically. One is sort of technology will open up bold new vistas for the entire universe and will help us rethink how we work and live in a positive way. And the other is, we'll be taken over possibly by our robot masters. I think the most important piece on this is actually thinking about what are the values that we're pursuing and how are we, these are things that are not just happening to us, but that we can influence. And how are we thinking about how we can set up our value system to influence the future? So with no further ado, Rob?
All right, so if you haven't had a chance to read Martin's book, The Rise of Robots, Technology and the Threat of a Jobless Future, I highly recommend it to you. As a way of framing the conversation with these two contrasting points of view about the future of work and the role that technology is playing in the evolution of the workplace, what I wanted to do is just announce what I think is the central question within Martin's book as a way of beginning the conversation, which is that technological changes and how they've played out in the workforce threaten over a several-decade future to displace not only workers who have earned something like a high school degree or less, but even well-educated, white-collar workers. And we're moving into a future because of the fruits of technological innovation, in particular automation, machine learning, artificial intelligence, that will displace enormous portions of the labor force. And the question about what to do in a future where the number of jobs is just many, many, many fewer. Now, I think the central question in the book is, we've had technological change many times in the past. One thing you may know is an interesting data point is that in the year 1900, more than 50% of all American jobs were on farms. In the year 2000, the number was 2%. And so the technological evolution that affected agriculture surely displaced people, but it didn't create a jobless future. And the question I want to begin with is why Martin Ford thinks this time, this particular technological change, automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, is different from ones in the past. He's going to be the Eeyore on the panel, the one who's predicting a dystopian jobless future. Tim O'Reilly is the Tigger on the panel. He thinks that technology is not going to displace workers, but will in fact augment them, or at least has the potential to augment workers and humans rather than displacing them from the labor force. That's the fulcrum of our debate, and we'll begin with Martin by asking him, why is this particular moment different from times in the past?
Okay, thank you. Let me start by saying that I'm always characterized as the pessimist, and it's true that I am pessimistic about the job market. I'm pessimistic about the idea that our current economic and social model, where you have to have a job and derive an income from that if you want to survive economically, is sustainable. I think that something is going to change. I do think that we are at the leading edge of potentially a massive disruption, and it's going to be ultimately our choice. We can either choose to adapt to that in a way that gives us a very positive, optimistic future, or we can fail to adapt, and then I do think it could be quite dystopian. But to answer the question, why is this time different? And Rob, of course, talked about agriculture, which is maybe the classic example that people will give. It is true. Most people used to work on farms. Now it's 1% to 2% of people. So there was a massive technological disruption there, but it was a very specialized mechanical disruption. It was tractors and it was combines and all the rest that came in and eliminated those jobs. And at the time that that happened, of course, there was the whole rest of the economy out there to absorb those workers. For example, people moved from agriculture. Eventually, they found jobs in factories. Now, in advanced countries, of course, most people work in the service sector. So what you've seen is a kind of a sector-by-sector disruption where people have essentially moved from one fundamentally, typically routine type of job, working on a farm, to then working in a factory, to then working in the service sector. This time, what we're looking at is different, I think, in two ways. The first thing is that the machines are, in a limited sense, beginning to think. They're taking on cognitive capability. We've now got machines that are solving problems, that are essentially beginning to learn, and that's perhaps the most important thing. And secondly, this has now become a general purpose technology in the sense that it's going to scale across everything. It's going to invade every employment sector. But it's that combined, especially with this idea that machines are learning. I think this is really the central thing that is really becoming kind of the driving force behind it. And it's really going to be just an enormously disruptive, scalable technology. Just to give you one specific example, you may have heard a few months ago that Google's DeepMind application was able to defeat the best Go player in the world. And I don't know if you're familiar with the game of Go, but I will tell you two things about it. The first is that at any point in the game, the number of possible moves that you can make is essentially infinite. There are actually more possible moves in a game of Go than there are atoms in the universe. Okay, so in other words, it's something that simply is not computable by applying the kind of brute force technique that you would apply in chess, where you simply have a computer using very fast calculation, look many moves ahead and try to figure out the optimal possibility. You can't take that approach with the game of Go. The second thing to understand is that if you talk to one of the best Go players in the world, sit them down and ask them, what are you doing? Explain why you made that move. Give me a kind of a step-by-step analysis of why you decided to do that. They can't do it. In fact, it's something that's just kind of intuitive. It happens inside their brain. They can't articulate why they made a particular move. And so what that means, if you're a computer programmer sitting down with this person attempting to develop an algorithm, there's simply nowhere for you to begin. So given those two facts, I think it's fair to say that this is an example of something that you want to be able to look at and say, hey, you know what, this is not something that at least in the foreseeable future is going to be subject to automation. There's no way that artificial intelligence is going to take on this particular challenge. And yet, a few months ago, Google built a system, and essentially what it did is it began by learning based on looking at historical data, games that had been played in the past. And then the next step was they set up that system to play games against itself to become even better. And so what happened is that this system essentially taught itself to play the game, and then within short order became superhuman and was able to defeat the best player in the world. So that's the kind of technology that we're looking at, and that's something that is going to advance dramatically over the next few decades. And I think that what it leads to is a world where just about anything that is on some level routine, repetitive, and predictable. Think of an average job out there in the economy and ask yourself, could another person learn to do this job by studying the historical record? If a person could do that, then eventually there's going to be an algorithm that can do that. So it's going to really, I think, lead to the evaporation of just a massive percentage of the work that's out there than a lot of people are doing today. So I think that that's really why this time is different.
Ross Perot described NAFTA as a giant sucking sound coming from Mexico, sucking jobs out of the United States down there. Is it fair to say that you think automation, this particular technological change, is a giant sucking sound bringing everything up to the cloud? Automation, machine learning, intelligence in the cloud, and we're going to have the platform owners of the robots that are doing the jobs that humans used to do will be the ones who own what's in the cloud, concentrating their power, diminishing the number of people in the labor force.
Yeah, I think that's the basic idea. And you don't have to take it to extremes. I mean, no one is arguing that every job is going to disappear. or even most of the jobs are going to disappear. But I think it's reasonable to say that something on the order of half the jobs out there, maybe more, are fundamentally routine and repetitive and predictable in nature. Those jobs are going to be under stress. And we don't have to imagine that all those jobs disappear. If 20% of the jobs in the economy were to disappear and not be replaced by alternatives that are accessible to the people impacted, that's a massive social and economic upheaval.
Mm-hmm. All right, so Tim, you talk not about technology replacing workers, but augmenting workers. Let me just begin by having you respond directly to Martin. Do you think this time is not different, or do you think it could be different if we make the right policy choices?
You mean it could be different if we make the wrong policy choices?
Or it could be different if we make the wrong policy choices.
I think if you do look at the history of the Industrial Revolution, the farming revolution, it wasn't just that there was displacement to new areas, and finally we've run out of places to go. So that which is part of the argument that we're effectively you can't just go to a new sector. I think what we saw was that as you replaced people with machines, returns went to the owners of capital. Eventually, the people fought back, and they said, "Wait a minute, this is not working for us." We saw revolutions, we saw unrest, and eventually there was a new balance. And we figured out some ways to soak up the excess human capacity. For example, we used to send small children to work, and we said, "No, we'll send them to school instead." We had successive waves of educating at a higher and higher level, for example, as a way to invest in people. The point that I believe fundamentally is that we make choices. David Rolfe, the SEIU labor activist, has this great line. He said, "God did not make being an auto worker a good job." There were a set of policy choices that were made, and we have made a very different set of policy choices over the last 30 years than we made in that period when we had good jobs. And I think technology gets blamed way too often for something that is fundamentally a set of policy choices. We act as though the market is sort of, akin to a natural law. And that's not to say that there aren't sort of things that are akin to natural laws in the market, but it is a designed system. We have tax policy, we have labor laws. For example, back in the period when you had, quote, good jobs, you had stronger labor unions. You had a very different relationship of government to the very idea of employment. The dominant policy goal in the post-war years was full employment. And then that led to cost-push inflation as wages went up, and eventually they went, whoa, we've got to control inflation. So the last 30 years, we've been trying to control inflation. And so that's a systematic decision. But the one that for me seems like the most fundamental thing is nothing to do with technology. It actually has to do with the fact that at some point we made a decision to stop investing in our economy. And the example I use is, I've taken off a couple of times, done a little bit of analysis on the carrier plant that Donald Trump made a centerpiece of his campaign where they're shipping the jobs to Mexico. Now, he wants to do tariffs. I have a much better solution. Stop putting all the money into stock buybacks. If you go look at United Technologies, the parent of Carrier, they reinvested about 15% of their profits in the business. They invested 85% in stock market gains. $13 billion in free cash flow, $2 billion went back into the business in some kind of productive investment. $2 billion out to shareholders in the form of dividends, $8.5 billion in the form of stock buybacks designed to enrich, the stockholders, designed to enrich management who have been told your job is to be aligned with the shareholders, not with any other stakeholders. And if you look throughout our economy, it's a multiplayer game where we have kneecapped all of the players except financial capital. And I think if you want to look at the machine that we should be afraid of, it is this constructed machine that we call the market that we programmed wrong. We gave it some rules that have led precisely to our current consequences. So what's the alternative? I think it actually does start with changing some of the rules of our, sort of financial system, tax policy, labor policy. But more fundamentally, that's just to create a level playing field again. Once we do that, we have to say, okay, we need to start actually making more productive investment. If we went from 15% to 25% to 35%, what would we do with it? Well, first thing, you pay people more. We've come with this notion that, well, the market wants people to be paid less. And but that's assuming that it says it's there's only one pot of money to be tapped. And the fact is, if you say, for example, took Walmart and went to $15 an hour. Again, I went and did the math. $15 an hour on Walmart's wage base would add about a penny to every dollar of cost passed on to consumers if it were passed off entirely to consumers. It could also come entirely out of corporate profits. It could be split between consumers and corporate profits. So it's really not that big. And when people have money to spend, they what's the big problem in the economy? It's actually low growth. The fact that nobody in fact, has the money to spend because we don't pay people. Capital does not spend lots and lots of money, in the ordinary economy. Whereas if you pay people more, so anyway, that's the first thing you do. But then the second thing you do is you say, okay, what problems do we have that are not, being dealt with? We have so many things to do. And I kind of go back to this. Nick Hanauer had this great line. Nick Hanauer, early investor in Amazon, very wealthy guy who's been very active in labor advocacy since then. But he pointed out, I think very correctly, that he said, look, technology is the solution to human problems. We won't run out of work till we run out of problems. And I look around me and I see problems everywhere that we are not investing in. So again, you take that money that we've been putting into Wall Street games, you start putting it into productive investment. You fix our infrastructure. You fix, our energy economy. In some ways, climate change is going to be our World War II that's going to pull us out of our Great Depression because we're going to go, shit, we need all the machines, we need all the people. We're going to have to totally re-engineer our society or we're totally screwed, right? So there's a whole lot there before us. But the third thing, and this is the thing that Keynes talked about in Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, which is this idea that once you've solved the basic problems of life, if you have a reasonable distribution of income, a reasonable distribution of the fruits of productivity, people will find things to do with it. And my argument for that is simply to walk down the streets of any prosperous city. And what do you see? You see human creativity. Nobody needs to have 3 different Ethiopian restaurants within walking distance of my house. Nobody needs to have clothes that get changed out twice or 3 times a year in fashion. Constant supply of new entertainment so that we can't see. But that is a huge part of our economy because that's what we do. When food became really cheap, we started finding ways to make it expensive. It has to be organic. Oh, wait, it has to be gluten-free. It has to be, farm to table. These are creative rebrandings, layering on of creativity onto commodities. And I think that's really the other part of our economy. I think a huge part of it is going to be doing things that are currently impossible today, which it will involve, solving real problems that we have not even thought of. Again, I go back to those weavers of Ned Ludd's time. They couldn't, if you had said to them, we're going to dig a tunnel under the English Channel over to France, they would have thought you were utterly mad. If you had said to them, we're going to, build a skyscraper in the desert that's a half-mile high, that's in Dubai right now, they would have thought you were utterly mad. They said, we're going to go to the moon, we're going to, fly through the air. That's what these machines are going to do. So I have to ask, when we have these AIs that are able to do so much, what will they make possible that we can't even imagine? And we got to get on with it.
All right, so you see the Eeyore and Tigger description is not totally inappropriate here. Martin, I'm going to give you a chance to respond, because I imagine you don't disagree at all that we can make some different policy choices to redistribute the fruits of productivity gains in a different way than we do today. But I take it that part of your main challenge to what Tim just described is that as the labor force evolves in a way that just fundamentally displaces an increasing number of jobs, we have people whose economic security is much less certain, and modest tweaks to tax policy might not be sufficient. And your book ends with a tentative embrace of a universal basic income, so maybe we should get there in a moment. But I just want to see where you part ways with Tim, because policy change is fine. We can all put forward our favorite policies. But what's he got wrong about the glorious technological future that awaits us, augmenting the possibilities of humanity?
Well, I think I certainly do agree with a lot of what Tim said. I mean, policy is critical, but I would argue that looking back at, say, the 1950s and the 1960s and saying, well, they had good policies then, and we should sort of go back to that in terms of,
That's not what I
for
said,
example,
but,
having
yeah. I think we need
labor
very
unions
different
and so forth.
policies today.
But I think we're going to need dramatically different
Yeah.
policies in the future. We're going to have to very much think outside the box. It's not going to be tweaking things around the margins. I mean, capitalism has got built into it some fundamental incentives, and among those is the incentive to reduce labor costs, to save on labor. That's something that's inevitable. So when we talk, for example, about how we should pay people more, I do absolutely agree with that problem. In fact, I've got an entire chapter on this in my book where I talk about the fact that if people, of course, don't have incomes because they aren't getting paid enough or because they're unemployed, then we don't have consumers to drive the economy. And I personally think that phenomenon may already be manifesting as the kind of stagnation that we see. You may have heard, for example, economists like Larry Summers talking about secular stagnation, where I think that comes about in part because there is not enough demand to really drive the economy and therefore create investment opportunities for companies to really invest. So that we may be already seeing that already. But the question is, what can you do about that? Can you bring labor unions back? Maybe you can raise the minimum wage and that helps at the low end, but what about everyone else? How do you artificially force companies to pay people more? I don't see a good solution to that. You tax the hell
out of capital and you lower the taxes on labor.
Well, that's a big part of it, yeah, but I don't necessarily see that will solve the problem. I think we need something beyond that for sure, especially as huge numbers of people are disenfranchised. So I think we're basically in agreement on the importance of policy. I just think that, and again, keep in mind that I'm thinking into the future. I'm thinking at a minimum 10 years from now, maybe 30 years from now, somewhere in that range. What's going to happen then? And that's what I'm thinking toward. And I think that we're going to need something genuinely radical. We're going to have to completely restructure the system that we have now.
So,
I don't disagree with that, by the way. I mean,
you don't disagree with that? Yeah. So we have on the table an agreement about some fundamental restructuring about the nature of the economy. We've talked about tax policy. We've talked about various ways of securing people's economic fortunes. Universal basic income comes up in your book, Martin. What about something like, I'm curious to have an answer to the question, who do you think is going to own the robots, or the robotic platforms that will be displacing labor? And what about a fundamental restructuring of property rights, perhaps initially through some antitrust legislation to break up the platform owners that are going to reap, under the current system of rules, the vast majority of the productivity gains that people now adapt to and use? Take the driverless car future. Whoever owns those platforms is going to have an enormous infrastructure, an enormous, if not monopoly, near monopoly. What about restructuring property ownership of the platforms?
Me first?
Either of you.
Sorry.
No, go on.
Well, robots and technology are capital, and we know how the ownership of capital is distributed in the world today. It's very, very concentrated among a few people at the top, and there's no reason to expect that that's not going to continue to be the case. Now,
there is a very good reason, and we're seeing it today, and it is the political response. It's happened many, many times that basically you treat people badly long enough, they say, okay, we've had enough. And I think that we're already seeing that in the political situation around the world today. Even though I don't think anybody is coming there with a solution, to me, I put this in the context of scenario planning, and you kind of go, well, what's unthinkable and what's a robust response? And I'll tell you that we have had this sort of, this great wake-up call where, for example, the Trump revolution with Brexit, where the things that seemed unthinkable suddenly became very thinkable. And, civilizations have fallen many times in the history because people got this one wrong. And, there's nothing that says the current situation will inevitably continue.
Well, I mean, it's true. We are seeing a political disruption, and we now have Donald Trump who has on offer a bigger tax cut than Paul Ryan, right? So the disruption is there. It's created change, but there's no evidence that I can see that that's gonna change the distribution of capital. So I think that it's kind of optimistic to think that we're gonna have this enormous social upheaval and political upheaval and disruption, and somehow that's gonna lead to some sort of a very optimistic outcome.
I think it would lead to a very, very pessimistic outcome, which is why I think we need to get ahead of it. I don't think it leads to an optimistic, again, I look at, I'm a classicist by training, not a technologist, and I look at the fall of Rome. I look at, the factors I've been kind of, well, yeah, we're kind of right on track. This is what's next. We're at, Pompeii, and the response to the pirates after 9/11. Here we are at, when do we get our Julius Caesar? It's like, for Christ's sake, I love Mark Twain's reputed remark, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme.
I think I might withdraw my description of you as Tigger at this point. So you've got laid out for us now significant political upheaval, and repeat your line, we had better get out in front of it,
That's
lest
right.
it eat us alive, which I take as a version of the conclusion.
And one of the outcomes of significant political upheaval may well be an interruption of the progress of technology. Right? Because again, you'll sit here with Ray Kurzweil and he'll show you these long graphs, and I always sort of say, yeah, but I just want to remind you that the Hagia Sophia was the largest building in the world for 1,000 years. Yeah. The long arc of the graph, and you can have a lot of flat points.
All right, so where are
at least at the scale of a single human lifetime.
Where are the sources of countervailing power to the power of capital and the existing rules of the political economy, other than amongst the recent rebellion of white working class voters?
Common sense, judgment.
Well, common sense isn't yet countervailing
power.
power.
But again, think about it. Franklin Roosevelt was a member of the moneyed class who basically said, oh, wait, things aren't going so well. We've been going down the wrong path. This is not working. I think it is possible to say, yes, we need to change the direction of our society in some fundamental ways.
All right, so I imagine expressed that way, you also don't disagree with that, Martin. We have to change the direction of society in some fundamental ways. And Tim suggested that one possible mechanism for doing so is to interrupt the current path of technological change. You've sketched a certain type of dystopian future in which technological change displaces large numbers of workers. How do you view an agenda for change that might avoid a future in which people are left without prospects of either a good-paying job, a well-paying job, or no job at all?
Right. I definitely agree that we could see a situation where progress is diminished or halted, and it could partly be, as Tim said, from social upheaval and also from the economic impact that I've been talking about, the fact that you're not going to have people out there to drive capitalism and to create the incentive for more investment in technology. So that's a very negative scenario. I'm actually a techno-optimist in the sense that I think technology is a good thing. It's the thing that has afforded us progress in the past. Any typical middle-class person today is probably much better off in almost every way than a very rich person 100 or more years ago. Certainly you're going to live longer and you have a better life, and that's because of technology. I would say the last thing we want to do is say to our children and our grandchildren, you're not going to benefit from that progress because we're going to allow everything to sort of fall apart. So the whole idea is to adapt to this. And we've talked about the distribution of capital, but I focus more on income. I think that some form of a universal basic income as an income distribution mechanism is really probably the most practical and feasible way to approach this. I think that if you, for example, talk about redistributing capital as opposed to income, that's even more politically toxic than the idea of dealing with income.
I would just say that politically toxic has always been the reason why people go off the cliff. At some point, we're going to have to deal with the fact that 25% of all profits in our economy now go to the financial sector. Used to be 3%. That's not a healthy economy. And the 15% of reinvestment from corporate America goes back into the real economy is not a healthy situation. And again, I'm not a policymaker or an economist, so I don't know that, for example, a higher tax on capital gains would be the answer. I do suspect, though, looking at what are you trying to solve for, you kind of go, well, we actually have a problem on the consumer demand side. So lowering taxes on people, raising them on companies, raising them on capital gains would seem to me to be going in the right direction. I think raising minimum wages, I think shortening work weeks. Again, this is what we've done in the past that worked quite well. And it was interesting. I talked with David Autor, the labor economist. I was sort of saying, aren't there natural experiments in universal basic income? And he said, yeah. Saudi Arabia and Norway. Saudi Arabia, work is looked down on. They use guest workers, and they have all these sort of phony sinecure jobs for Saudis, mostly on the government dole. It's not a very effective society. You look on the other side at Norway, everybody works, all work is valued. Everybody works, they just work a little less. And so there's sort of, to me, there's sort of a really interesting thing of putting universal basic income certainly fits that model, of like how do we just actually, but so do, reducing the work week and raising wages. The fact is you want to get everybody to a certain level. You want to get people to have money in their pockets, able to spend, and then you start actually also really tackling the hard problems that we're not tackling right now, and instead just sort of concentrating the capital.
Yeah. Did you want to respond to that? It looked like you had something to say.
Just in general, I don't disagree with a lot of this. I mean, we can worry a lot about things like antitrust. We can worry about the financial sector, the fact that artificial intelligence is increasingly dominated by just a few companies. Those are all potential problems that need to be solved. But solving those problems is not going to get income or capital into the hands of the person that's today working at McDonald's, say. So I do think we need some distribution mechanism, something like a guaranteed income that is going to really address that issue. Saudi Arabia is not a very good example, I don't think, of a guaranteed income because it's not a very functional economy. There have been other experiments done with basic incomes that have produced much more positive results, and actually there are some that are going to be done in, for example, Finland and in the Netherlands that will provide more data. So I do think that it's
there's a
much more positive story than you might think.
There's a session tomorrow at the conference here on universal basic income and some of the experiments that are going to be done on it as well. So a preview of coming attractions for that. So I want to ask one more question and then open the floor up to questions from the audience. And I've been a faculty member here at Stanford for about 20 years. Having seen the rise in, let's call it, global consciousness of the place of Silicon Valley as the white-hot center where human talent is meant to flow in order to reinvent the world and to change the course of humanity. Stanford is the place that imagines itself as the training ground for that new class of technological leaders. The descriptions that you've both given about the need for policy change, which is to say to get involved fundamentally in politics, not just to announce what wise policy would be, I mean, so Tim, when you say, for example, I think common sense can be a source of countervailing power, nothing that you've described seems to me obviously an unwise policy prescription, but there's also nothing you've described so far that just gives any indication about how you're going to get masses of people to sign on to what would
Well,
be
I think the work that Nick Hanauer and David Rolfe did with the minimum wage ordinance in SeaTac and then spreading it to other areas was a really great example. They basically realized that the 20th century way was you organize workers. They realized that the 21st century way is you organize the public. They've gotten minimum wage ordinances passed in a whole lot of places, which I think creates a very different way of aggregating sort of power to ordinary people. And I think that we're going to find new mechanisms by which people can coordinate. And right now the thing that's sort of interesting is in our current political situation, these mechanisms have been hijacked by people who actually are going to keep playing the old game.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that there aren't people out there who are starting to figure out how to use, different ways of aggregating power, through networks. And, we're just at the very beginning of understanding that our current, business and social and economic structures are not the only way to do it. And the fact is, when you have, 1.8 billion people on Facebook, knowing how to work the levers of power on Facebook may actually get you something that you just couldn't get before.
Right.
And so I think that there's a lot of surprises in our future.
What's your view about the track record of Silicon Valley technologists in policy prescription and political change?
Well, I think that we're just sort of starting to get into that. I mean, I don't think that there's a long track record there, really, other than being very focused on supporting innovation. I mean, I think this is the first time that really people in Silicon Valley are really beginning to think about issues like this. And you are seeing, initiatives like a Y Combinator, the experiment that's going to be done with the basic income and so forth. So I think that's great. But again, I think that we need to understand that there are some basic rules of capitalism that we're not going to be able to change. I mean, there's a lot of talk about raising the minimum wage. Okay, I think that's a good thing, probably in the short run. It will help a lot of people. But we can't escape the fact that will increase the incentive for automation. Whether you do it through the minimum wage or you do it for unionizing people, if you artificially raise wages in some manner, that is going to trade the human-machine trade-off is going to be altered, and that means that companies will have more incentive to automate. And in the long run, you're going to see an impact.
Again, I would just sort of ask, when you say companies will have some incentive, we have programmed our entire sort of the training that we give in business schools, the training that we give to executives, the corporate governance says disregard the people, right? Favor capital. This is not like the law of gravity. This is training. We have trained our business people to think that way. I don't think that way about my company. I don't think that, in the past, that was in fact the dominant model of business. You went, we have a bunch of stakeholders, right? And right now in Germany, they have much more of a stakeholder capitalism model where they're sitting there going, okay, we have a bunch of constituencies to satisfy, not just, shareholders. And so I think we have to question that assumption that the market wants this. We have been brainwashed into thinking that this is the only way to do it. And to me, the biggest thing I think about with technology is understanding that we are living inside a machine, a human construct, and we have programmed it, and we have programmed it wrong. And we can reprogram it. That is, to me, the big intersection of technology and this question. And in fact, one of the things that I hope is that AI will help us to get new insights into how to reprogram the economy.
Yeah, okay, so what I'm taking away from this exchange up here is that whatever you in the room are thinking about how to referee the disagreement about technological unemployment in the future, Martin's forward-looking prescription of a universal basic income, I think it's fair to say, appears to Tim as a kind of software patch on a big problem that's fundamentally rooted in the basic rules of the economy and what you have in mind to try to stave off this dystopian future, if in fact that's to come, is something that amounts to a much more fundamental rewiring of the entire political economy, not the introduction of a policy fix called the universal basic income. I
think that's a very, very good summary, yeah, for me.
Now it's time to open it up to your questions. So I think there are microphones floating around. We've got about 10 minutes, 15 minutes before we move on to the next session. So if you could give us your name, and then please go ahead and ask a question.
Margaret Levy, Director of the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. So this is a really good follow-up to what Tim was just saying. I think politics and policy are important. But what I'm really concerned about are the norms that people have and the kinds of ways, the kinds of beliefs they have about what constitutes evidence and facts. And what we've been thinking about is our Future of Work and Workers project at CASBIS, the center, has changed is really about the variation in moral economies and how you create a set of reciprocal obligations among the population, the government, the corporations that is more humane and fits with the changing world. And that requires, it seems to me, things that you have only alluded to. It's not just change in practices, it's really trying to figure out how it is that people come to believe what they believe and how you create the kinds of norms that make them more inclusive, more encompassing, recognizing each other's needs, and creating a set of obligations within the market and within politics that meet that. So it was more a statement, but if you have some responses, that would be great.
Any reply?
Well, I do think that all of this is going to be an enormous challenge to our sort of ingrained values, and in particular, the Protestant work ethic, the idea that either someone is working hard and producing or they're a slacker. And again, as an advocate of something like a universal basic income someday, I think that we're going to have to rethink that. And maybe in more humane terms, we're going to have to value contributions that people make in ways other than simply doing something productive in the economy as we understand it today and so forth. So I think there's a big shift there.
I think that's absolutely right. There's a lot of activities that people spend time on today that are currently unpaid that are actually a form of work. You think about, just take social media and think of it as a form of entertainment, for example, and you realize how much of it is peer-produced, right? And all this, Facebook gets that for nothing. Comcast gets that for nothing. When they're providing you internet services, they're getting paid. I remember this used to come to me when Comcast and the various ISPs were complaining that they should be paid for carrying this traffic. I go, wait a minute, if you want to get content out of Hollywood, you pay them for it. You're getting this for free. And so the question really is that work? And certainly it's already starting to be work for a lot of people. I think Hank Green estimates there's now something like 37,000 people who are making a living, producing YouTube videos. There are probably tens of thousands of others, on other social media channels. So, it's beginning in that sense. And I'm not suggesting that, sort of Facebook should be allocating their ad revenue to people who generate, engagement. Other than the way that they're doing it. But it is worth thinking about, just around the definition of work. We've created protective enclaves over time where people basically get paid to play. I thought of this, I was in classics, as I mentioned, and a friend of mine sent me his paper on images of bees in Homer. And I thought, what a lucky group of people this is, who get paid to think about things like that. And of course, that's been under attack. But that is, in fact, a pretty interesting model of the future. There, people getting to pursue these deep, interesting things that they're curious about.
And the universal basic income turns out to be something like tenure.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah. Next question.
Hi, I actually was curious. You mentioned a lot of the strengths of the existing system, that it incentivizes a certain set of behavior, and I think I've heard a theme of human beings being really bad at doing anything that doesn't seem to be in their own self-interest. And I'm wondering if there are any weaknesses in the current set of incentives that you see as exploitable, things that we could do in the short term that aren't massive policy changes, but that might help to tweak or realign the incentives of the existing capitalistic structure to allow for more of this change to happen incrementally as opposed to have to be like this sweeping change that takes place over the course of many decades, perhaps.
I mean, it's hard to come up with short-term solutions. I think that, my focus is really on the long term, and I do think it's inevitable. I think, again, that if you gave people a universal basic income, then they would find within themselves the incentive to do many positive things. I don't think that most people just want to sit around and be a slacker. I think that people would choose to do positive things, and many of those things would be helpful in the community. They would work with other people. They would work to solve many of the problems that Tim has talked about that need solving. The problem is, it's hard for me to imagine some kind of ad hoc mechanism where we've got all these little schemes where people get paid for doing these things. To me, it's much simpler to just have a universal basic income. And actually, I prefer another name for that, which would be a citizen's dividend. And the idea is that we have this fantastically wealthy, technologically advanced society, and that is really the result of generations of people that have worked and contributed to that. Could we not make the argument that that is, in a sense, kind of a public resource, almost like oil under the ground, and perhaps everyone ought to have a stake in that and ought to be able to derive some income from that. And so the idea is you give people that basic safety net, and then you rely on maybe their individual incentives to go and do positive things.
But it's interesting because the current discussion tends to be about income tax rates, and it really need to come somewhere entirely else. Various kinds of Pigovian taxes, carbon tax. I think a financial transactions tax would actually be a Pigovian tax. But the thing that we're really looking at is how do we get from here to wherever we're going? And clearly we have an existing safety net. We spend a lot of money. I think something like $700 or $800 billion a year here in the U.S., and it's badly done. And we can make that much more efficient. That's a lot of what we're working on at Code for America. You save 10% on the safety net. By figuring out how to make it work better, getting rid of a lot of the inefficiencies in the system, you've put a lot more money in people's pockets. And I think simplifying some of the programs so they really are much more like a basic income would be a transition towards that. We've tended, if you read some of the literature on how some of these programs have been rated, for other purposes and tweaked. In various states, it's actually not putting money in people's pockets, and the more directly we do that, I think the better.
Next question, please.
Yeah, hi. I'm Daniel Mintz. I'm the chief data evangelist at Looker. And I just wanted to sort of point out, Martin, you said a couple of times, you used the word artificial about raising wages, and I just wanted to point out that I think that kind of contradicts a bit of what Tim was saying, that it assumes that the way that wages are now is a natural state when in fact they are very much a result of policy choices. And given that we've just come through a campaign and really a number of years where a number of norms and mores are changing and have been breached, that have perhaps historically held us in check or sort of provided the bumpers that kept us on going down one lane. I wonder if you both, looking to the nearer future rather than the decades out future, see this as an opportunity or a moment of crisis where because so many of the norms have been breached, where we have an opportunity to sort of write new norms or write new laws or take advantage of this sort of crisis-opportunity, if you will.
Well, I think there are short-term opportunities. I mean, I would kind of disagree with the idea that all this current greed that we have is something new and it's never existed before, and it all came out of Harvard Business School, in the last couple of decades or something. I mean, this idea that there's this continuous drive within capitalism to minimize labor costs, to save on labor, to drive wages down if possible, goes back to the Industrial Revolution. I mean, Marx worried about all this stuff, right? So it's not something that's new. I do think that the technology that's now coming in place is going to amplify that and make it, a dramatically bigger impact, and that's what we have to
No, I
worry about.
understand. I'm not saying it's new either. I think, but what is new is that we amplified the tendency to reward capital and suppress the ability of labor to fight back. And I think that's, part of the dynamic that's different. And it's gone through, and it's not just, capitalism. Same thing is true in politics. Think about the divine right of kings. There was a counter push against that, and eventually that was diminished. And I can certainly imagine that there's a future where we look back and they write about this period when they believed in the divine right of capital. And again, I am a capitalist, so I'm not like I come across sounding like I'm some kind of crazy, left-wing communitarian. I'm not saying that. I am saying that we assume that our current society is the only way we could be organized. And history teaches us that there are many, many different ways to organize the society. And we will have to, in the age of AI, we will have to think radically differently about what that might look like. And we probably will not be able to think it, but one day it will sort of evolve through a series of changes and choices, and we'll look back and we'll go, oh, that's how we got here.
All right, let's do one more question. I'm not sure where the microphone is.
Right here.
Go ahead.
Okay, hi. So I'm Deborah Satz. I'm a philosophy professor here at Stanford, and this follows right on what was being said. Just like we sometimes think of markets as natural, we also think of the development of technology as natural. And one thing that's, I think, come out in this discussion is the way technology develops itself is the result of policy choices. We've allowed, the market to determine a lot of the direction that technology takes. And so I'm wondering, in terms of the tendency of technology to develop in a labor-saving direction, as opposed to a resource-conserving direction, which would be much more socially beneficial, what do you think the options are in tax policy for redirecting technology away from labor-saving to resource-conserving uses?
Well, I think as Tim said, one thing that I think clearly will need to do in the future is to tax capital more and labor less. I mean, if in fact work and jobs are going to disappear, then we're not going to be able to continue to tax labor and support all our, our social safety net programs in that way, the way we have in the past. Beyond that, I'm generally not a big fan of this idea that we can somehow regulate or direct technology. I mean, I really think it's kind of an organic thing that over time creates progress, and I think that governments are not going to be equipped to put in place regulations or specific tax policies that redirect this and that. I think that it's much better to come up with a holistic sort of solution, something I keep mentioning, the guaranteed income, but a way to sort of adapt the whole system and allow it to progress organically while still ensuring that we have a safety net in place for those people that are going to be impacted.
Yeah, I would just say what you just identified, resource-conserving technologies as opposed to labor-saving technologies, is a great way to think about an opportunity. Because I do think that Martin is absolutely right that we don't want somebody, in politics deciding that this is the way we're going to go. I mean, the thing that markets are really good at is trying lots of experiments and figuring out something new. But they often need to be led. Somebody takes them in a particular direction. And there is a role, a very significant role for government. I mean, our entire technology industry out here in the Valley is the result of decisions and investments that were made by the federal government, in World War II. The entire computer industry was birthed in World War II. Our aerospace industry, our sort of a lot of our chemicals, all these things were turbocharged by government policy decisions. So the role of government is, I think, in some ways, and the role of leadership is to identify hard problems that need to be solved. And then you turn the market loose on those hard problems. And I think we have plenty of those hard problems coming at us, and we're going to need the machines to help us.
And with that, would you please join me in thanking Martin Ford and Tim